Hello.
Hello. Hi, Richard. I've not had the opportunity to meet with you, although I've read much of your text as was prescribed reading during the master's at the University of Houston under Peter Bishop.
Um,
It's an honor to finally have the chance to see you present in person. I see that we are recording. So I'm just going to take one moment to open up the proper window on my screen. So we are here for a presentation on does the rise of intelligent machines imply the decline of human agency? For those of you who are not familiar with Richard Slaughter, he completed his PhD in future studies at Lancaster University in 1982 and became recognized internationally as a futurist and foresight practitioner, author, editor, teacher, and innovator. During the early 2000s, he was president of the World Federation for Studies of the Future and foundation professor of foresight at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne. He currently works out of Foresight International, Brisbane, Australia, and with Luc van der Laan has co-designed two futures units for a new course at the University of Southern Queensland. His most recent book, Deleting Dystopia, can be downloaded online at usqpressbooks.pub Deleting Dystopia. I'm sure that you can find the address in his bio on the conference website. Richard, are you able to upload your presentation? You
I
have
don't
slides?
actually have a PowerPoint. This is an old-fashioned two-camera
Excellent.
based on some notes from a paper. So I don't have any sexy graphics or anything. Just me.
But it makes it so much more lively.
Well,
So
I
I
thought
look
it would
forward,
be a change to get away from the PowerPoints.
indeed. So thank you very much. Without further ado.
Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be able to take part in this meeting. I'm really sorry that I couldn't get to Paris. Laurie, my wife, and I went to a previous 50th in Norway, about 2017, no, 2 or 3 years ago, where we got together with people, and that would have to do for us because it is a very long way to come, and it was just not feasible for us. What I'd also like to say is how delighted I am to see the quality and the diversity of the offerings that are on show here at the conference. It is so good to know that the Federation is thriving. It's been through many ups and downs in its past, and I'm just really delighted to see the just as I said, the quality and diversity. What I'm going to do this morning is to give an overview summary of a piece I've been working on. And interestingly, listening to the last presentation, I was thinking, my goodness, how different this is to what this young scholar has done. And yet there was actually a link at the end when she quoted Tony Fry, because Tony Fry is one of the gurus of design futures. I think we all know that. And she very smartly, I think, quoted him on the way that corporate capitalism holds things back. So despite all the brilliant images and possibilities and technology and everything, people like Tony, and to some extent myself, we are asking folk also to focus on the cultural background. And that cultural background includes things like capitalism and other sorts of things. And indeed, it is essential to really understand the cultures we're working out of. An example of that is a piece I wrote for the APF's Compass magazine back in May 22, just called Deep Time. The whole point of writing that piece was to highlight how much of our present, our world, our very existence is absolutely and completely dependent on this vast process of life going back over millions of years on this world. And in order to live well, to be connected to and with life on planet Earth, that story is essential. But in fact, we find that it's been forgotten. So there's a process of social forgetting that we have to deal with even before we start thinking ahead. So lots of things like that about the way the present has been constructed out of materials that we're not really aware of. And so that helps to explain a little bit while I'm focusing on this very specific issue in a vast area. Some of you will know that I've written some other articles in Futures called Reassessing the IT Revolution, and they were gathered together and edited for that book that Catherine mentioned called Deleting Dystopia. And this current work that I'm doing is quite possibly the last of that series, that set, and quite possibly the last paper that I'll spend a great deal of far too much time and effort on trying to get right, because IT is such a fast-moving subject, a lot going on, and it's really difficult to know when to put a line down and say, I'm finishing at that point with the most recent developments. However, the issue of human agency, as the very first presentation some 2 or 3 hours ago mentioned, is always going to be central. So I hope what I'm going to say today gives just a few brief notes on some of the issues that have arisen in an IT context, and I'm specifically trying to answer that question about human agency. So one of the points that I start off with is, what is neoliberal culture about? And I've come up with the idea of the playbook that operates within it, of what I call careless, non-legal innovation. Now, what I mean by that is the way that private interests capture some aspect of tech, find ways to perfect it or improve it, and then let it loose on the human population, really in pursuit of growth, profit, and so forth, but not really having anything to do with human well-being. The best example I know is written up in an absolutely brilliant book by Shoshana Zuboff called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And her book looks in great detail. She spent 7 years writing this book, looking at the origins of the current IT scene. And she described in tremendous detail the way that Google, Facebook, and the other internet oligarchs got started. And essentially, this is cutting down very much to the bare bone. The early developments at Google were improvements to a search engine, developed in secrecy, patented, kept out of public sight, made available to people to improve their searching, and as a kind of a rider to that, simply soaking up the personal information of people as they use the tool. So done in darkness, done without consultation, done on the basis of quite really raw capitalist values. And therefore, if you see that as the playbook, that's in a sense what we've been dealing with as other things have been released into the public arena long before anyone had really understood the implications. It's led to the development of an internet which, as we're using it now, clearly has tremendous uses, very helpful. On the other hand, the downside just seems to grow over time. I saw a summary of web history, again, boiled right down to the essence quite recently, and it suggested 3 stages in the development of the internet. The first one was that it was an enabling process, which is obviously good. Everyone jumped on it. I remember very well the talk about the information superhighway. We had people like Nicholas Negroponte at the Digital Lab and others in the UK and elsewhere, just really expressing great confidence about the good things that would happen. And at that time, that seemed right. But the next stage that came up, according to this analysis, was that we weren't just doing it for pleasurable good things, but we were actually getting a sense of dependency where we started becoming dependent on these systems. And then more recently, as the background has got more and more problematic with increases of cyber attacks and a massive expansion of internet crime, we've been getting more and more vulnerable. Here in Australia recently, we've seen how the need to protect ourselves against the nasties out there. We're not just talking corporations, we're talking nation states as well, is actually beginning to impede on the value of the social product that we create. So it's beginning to become a very heavy deal. A second line is to do with what is Silicon Valley and what is it doing? Why has it done it? And again, I can't really go into this, but I can just mention a few points. Essentially, Silicon Valley is a machine that is designed to sell product. And it reminds me of, it becomes a selling machine. And I remember Donella Meadows' quote that you only need to spend millions if the value of the product is in doubt. Well, I think most people just accept that Silicon Valley is what it is, does what it does. We use some of the products. But there's a source that I would very much recommend to people by a lady called Kathy Cook, psychiatrist. She wrote a book called The Psychology of Silicon Valley. And I've put a digest to that on the Foresight International website. So if you go to the website, go to archive and research notes, you'll find a very detailed overview of a lot of the findings that she made. And so it's a very different view of something we all take for granted. Then the question of AI and human intelligence. Two very brief points here. AI is actually a misnomer. It came up in the 50s and it's been uncritically adopted. But it would be more clarifying if we talked about machine intelligence, because that gets it away from that issue about consciousness and intelligence. AI, as it stands, and always will, lacks things like mind, consciousness, identity, meaning. How do we know this? How can we be so sure? One of the books I most enjoyed in the recent times is a book by Iris Vallejo called Papyrus. This lady works out of the Great Library in Alexandria, but she's Spanish. And her walk through history showing how societies evolve language, books, discourse, culture. You can see how language is the very essence of culture. It's the very essence of humanity. Through language, we know ourselves and know who we are, where we're from, enables us to communicate. I've written about that in the paper. Seeing it as raw material from which abstract rules can be drawn out, producing this very thin simulacrum of language is a big issue. And it was one that was, one of the consequences was foreseen by Joseph Weizenbaum in his book, Computer Power and Human Reason, where he talked about how humans projected meaning on the results of machine operations. I haven't got time to talk about dangers and risks. Some of them, this really falls outside the question, so I'm not going to talk about that. But I do want to stress the idea that technologies aren't just good. We tend to think new stuff can do new things, very helpful, but technologies have an essential duality. You know that old story about the kitchen knife, useful for its correct purpose, devastating when used wrongly. And this is true of all technology. So I think we've been hooked on a story that technology is good, useful, helpful, but we've forgotten that the fact that there are so many bad actors in this environment that things aren't really going to work out the way we hope necessarily. And the point is here that there's so much more to come. Just three things, the redesign of viruses, gene editing, and quantum computing. I mentioned at the end of the earlier session that I'd watched a program, the lecture by a very capable scientist who was describing the work done here on quantum computing. And as I was watching that, I was torn between my respect for the hard work and the innovation that they were doing on the one hand, and then the complete absence on the other of any sense that this might need to be looked at much more carefully. Underlying this is something that can be called the techno-scientific worldview. And I think that's where we need to focus a great deal more attention. Work that I found very, very helpful in that respect is a book by Richard King. And the book is called Here Be Monsters, I do not like the title, but it comes from the monsters on the edge of the medieval map saying there's danger here, and it means danger. I think his work on this is absolutely brilliant because it opens out this kind of hidden dimension of tech, and then the way that technoscience overlooks or ignores social, economic, and political conditions. And almost everyone that talks about technology are focusing on the current form of it, what it does, and they're literally forgetting the long tail of reality, of worldview, culture, innovation, work, institutions that actually represent the greater part of what we're looking at. So I don't have time to talk about all the defects of the techno-scientific worldview, but it is a view in which we seem to be pushed into a kind of pervasive ethos of manipulation, which involves an intricate, we see ourselves as intricate, largely autonomous systems, as if humans were merely complex machines, which we're not. It promotes a kind of software, hardware dualism, and as such is part of a reductive, a simplified view of the world that attempts to render everything into its smaller parts. So in this view, it's not machines that provide so many threats to the future. The problem, certainly as Richard King sees it, is that humanity is tempted to see everything in machine-like terms. So time is rushing away. I'm going to try and cut to the chase and really talk a little bit here about some of the conclusions that emerge from this. We might say the problem isn't so much, another way of phrasing it, that technology is becoming more clever, but that very unfortunately people in general might be becoming more stupid. Why say that? Well, the rise of intelligent machines does seem to me to imply the decline of human agency, but, and this is a classic in futures thinking, only if we stay passive. The wide use and application of these machines will cause people, is causing people to become lazy, less well-equipped to handle reality. And we can all think of examples like the loss of reading skills, who remembers phone numbers anymore, and particularly the digital navigation, which has meant that a lot of people just have become dependent on the tech and have forgotten what it means to really pass the actual environment that you're in. We had a case of that when we were driving out one day. We're on the top of a hilly area wanting to get to the flat, and my wife found a road that went down from the top, but as soon as we turned into it, it wasn't a road, it was a track. And I had a very difficult choice about, is this car okay to run on this track where it's been raining? It looked like a road, it wasn't a road. There's a great case in the US recently where somebody was doing the same, and they followed a road by a river, but the software hadn't been updated, so he drove straight off into the river where a bridge had collapsed. These are examples of becoming over-dependent on something that we're not in control of, but which is really becoming overbearing. Another issue is that a lot of tech strips things of the very qualities that make them interesting, making these more and more efficient, whereas it's the inefficiency of things that is often most useful to us. And one example is the idea of the cashless society. And that's an idea that's been pushed and actually adopted very, very widely. But it really does take us into a very different world, because a lot of the informal uses of cash, particularly for marginal people, older people, people who don't necessarily go to their, not necessarily equipped to go to the computer and the online scene, they have all sorts of uses for cash, and so do charities when they're trying to get people to donate to something. I was given a chance the other day to donate to someone doing a charity walk, and I said, yeah, I'll support you, but I'm not going to put my information into this thing because I don't know how secure it is, but I'll give you the money. I'll give you the money directly. Now, if there's a cashless society, all this is seen as inefficient and it's lost, but there's no one that can guarantee the integrity of this system when there are so many people around the world working hard to bring it down. So we have had some progress towards regulation. That's been a dirty word in the US in many ways, but it's always after the fact. We've got, so one of the conclusions, and this links again with Tony Fry's point, it's time to limit the ability of private companies to make decisions about how, when, where, and if certain tech should be released. It needs to be viewed critically, carefully by entities outside the commercial sphere. And that's something that I think we can see the beginnings of now, but it's so desperately needed. There's so much else I could say, but I think I might leave the last word. There's a chap here who writes in Australia about art, and his piece comes up every week in a review. And I came across this quote from him, which I thought I would use to really wrap this up and still leave time for questions. And this is what he said in a very recent article. He said, perhaps the deepest conclusion is to remind us of the difference between AI as a machine for processing information and human consciousness as the seat of awareness, feeling, and understanding. It's consciousness that impels us to create art or to think, wonder, want to know. It is also consciousness that contemplates the meanings evoked by art and literature. Hence the statement here, while AI can emulate many of the operations of the mind, it does not replace consciousness, precisely because that's not a function of mind, reason, or data processing. So I'll just finish by mentioning 3 sources. Richard King's book, Here Be Monsters, Monash University this year. A book that helped me very much to get inside what was happening with digital is a book by Robert Hassan, just called Analog. And that, interestingly, was published by MIT in 22. I recommend that book very, very highly because it's the first source I've come across. My environmental scanning has been going on for many years. This is the first source I've come across that thoroughly investigates what is gained and what is lost by the shift from analog to digital. It's been made an automatic assumption. It's been pushed from every direction by competing commercial interests that are not interested in our well-being, but their bottom line. And hence we are sidling sideways or backwards into an overdetermined world in which indeed the things that we most care about, human agency, are under threat. But I do want to stress that as with avoiding any kind of dystopia, the secret is not to get overwhelmed by the prospect of difficult futures, but the key is always to understand them, to inhabit them virtually, if you like, to explore. Someone years ago suggested there needed to be a field called collapsology. And I think there should be one on dystopology as well, because if you understand where the current tendencies can lead in that direction, then I think that's where human agency comes back into force and means we get the equipment, the insights, the knowledge, the understanding, the motivation to actually make a change while it's happening.
Wow. Thank you very much, Richard. It is incredible how there are threads that are being woven into all of these presentations. At least I didn't have the opportunity to sit through every one this morning, but certainly from the ones that I have attended, it's enlightening to see how everyone's bringing a contribution to thinking that's happening here. Are there any questions or comments? We have 5 minutes for this session. Clarice?
I do. Thank you so much, Richard. It was like just an amazing contribution for us to think and reflect. So thank you very much for that. And also thank you very much for all the sources you mentioned. It's pretty good when someone just give us some path to go. I've been thinking like it was something that came across during my PhD. That was like my PhD is about culture, adding culture as a crucial element to foresight and to futures practices. And while doing that, I was observing many practitioners and possibilities, and I was thinking how much obsessed we are with some results and how much we are actually neglecting culture as something that is crucial into any foresight practice. We can see practice going into like tech, finances, politics, but we are kind of neglecting culture. And I was thinking, partially because of this technofix mindset, that we might solve things by rationality instead of looking at something that we cannot touch as culture is. And I'd like to hear more from you about like what do you think about the level of the dimension of culture in foresight practice, and yeah, how do you see that?
Sorry if I might interrupt. I'll just loop in the question that was asked also online, because it mirrors a bit what Clarice just mentioned, which is when we think of our technology as a mirror, what meanings do you find in humanities and futurists' fixation on AI? And
well, to answer the last one first, I deeply regret it, because we are so much more than anything that machines can emulate or pretend to be. The reflection of humans in tech is of a species that doesn't know itself well enough to be able to handle such powerful technologies safely. And that sort of leads back to the first question about culture. You know, it's so interesting that ever since I first got involved in the Federation, this discussion has been swinging across the Atlantic, particularly between the US and Europe, about the relative dynamics of tech and culture and what that all means. So this is a really old conversation. But I've become more aware in recent times, working with Luke on the courses at the university, how students come into these courses and they really have no idea about the commitments that are already enabled and enacted within the culture that they have been socialized into. It is almost as if the cultural formation and construction of identity and meaning has been forgotten, because we live in this Faith Popcorn called it a cocoon. The cocooning of human life has separated us out. And that's why I find deep time such a useful and fascinating thing, because it does remind us that deep in our bodies are the very cells that evolved 600 million years and billion years ago. We are connected in our own selves through our way our bodies are made. Great book recently by a guy called Steve Bruzat called the Rise and Reign of the Mammals. And again, casts a completely different light on how we got here, because the adaptations that make a successful biped themselves go back 80, 90 million years to get all those things working in the way they do. A lot of lineages fell off because they didn't work so well. So learning more about the past and how we got here in the first place, had that been part of our consciousness, I don't think we'd have the environmental crisis getting worse as we speak around us, because we have simply lost contact with who we are and where we're from. So that's just a little aspect of culture, and obviously there's far more to it. But I think that's the one that's relevant right now, because we've known about global warming, we've known about wildlife threats, we've known about all these issues. I saw them very clearly when I lived in Bermuda in the 70s and saw it happening there too. So this is a cultural, social, human failure to actually be honest about who we are, where we're from, and the planet that we are absolutely dependent on. So, it's a biggie, but just focusing on human agency, how we can still be powerful in these trying conditions, that just seems to me a very worthwhile thing to do.
Thank you very much, Richard. And our time is up, unfortunately. But thank you so very much for your contribution here. And I'm sure the conversations will continue throughout. Thank you so very much once again to you and to the participants here today. And
my pleasure.
Have a wonderful rest of the conference.
Thank you.